Welcome to the first lecture for Chapter 9, talking about personal relationships. As you may have noticed from your reading of this chapter, it is chock full of lots of important information about communication and personal relationships. Therefore, unlike most of the other chapters, this chapter has four mini lectures that you will be listening to cover the pretty dense material that's in this chapter. In this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about why relationships matter, and we'll cover the common characteristics of personal relationships. So why do personal relationships matter? Why is there a whole course on how we communicate in relationships? Why are there complete areas and disciplines of study understanding the dynamics in personal relationships? Things like social psychology and other majors and things like that. Well, this is because personal relationships really matter to our overall health. They matter to our mental health. They allow us to feel like that we belong and that we're a part of something. And so one of the first things that your chapter talked about is the need to belong theory. And essentially this theory suggests that each of us as human beings, we're born with this drive to seek and form and maintain and protect strong personal relationships. And that doesn't mean that we have to have, 100 close personal friends, but it does mean that good physical, mental health, we seek out at least a few close personal relationships, whether that's with our family or we have a romantic partner, or we have very close friends that we maintain those relationships in our lives. And so by maintaining relationships, we seek to fulfill this drive, this need to belong to these relationships. And in this class, we are going to focus on the aspect of interpersonal communications to form those social bonds and to maintain those social bonds. So those are going to be other aspects of this chapter that you'll hear about in the future lectures. The need to belong theory suggests that we need social bonds that are interactive. So in order for a relationship to meet this kind of criteria, to satisfy this need to belong, it has to meet two very important criteria. The social bond has to be interactive, and so this need to belong is not satisfied by relationships that maybe we are like, yeah, that person's our friend, but we never really talk to them, we don't interact with them. So you might think about maybe your best friend in elementary school. You probably still may consider them like a friend, somebody that isn't important to you, a bond that you have. But if you haven't talked to that person regularly in 3 or 4 years or a year or whatever, then that relationship, although important to you, maybe having importance to the kind of overall foundation and maybe your identity development, it's not interactive, and therefore that relationship, although important, would not meet this need to belong. And so the relationships that meet this need to belong must be interactive. They also need to be emotionally close. And so kind of the opposite is true here. If we oftentimes have interactions with people throughout the day, maybe fairly regularly. So maybe you go to the same restaurant and the owners know you and you interact and have small talk with them every time you go in. Maybe you see the same person at the McDonald's drive-thru every morning when you get your coffee, and you have an interaction with them every day. So there are people in our lives, your professors even, where you have frequent interactions with them on a fairly regular basis, but those interactions, that relationship is not emotionally close. You wouldn't label that person in maybe your social network or as having a close social bond. You may have a different kind of relationship with them, maybe a professional relationship, maybe a customer kind of relationship. So those wouldn't need the mean to belong theory because those relationships aren't emotionally close. The interactions need to be meaningful. They need to be working towards developing this kind of really interpersonal kind of relationship that we've been talking about in this class. We also know that relationships have certain rewards for us, both emotionally, potentially like tangible material rewards, and for our overall health. So our personal relationships are really important for helping us cope with potential challenges that we may have. Those people who we are in relationships with, they comfort us, they support us, they encourage us. And so those would be many of the emotional kinds of rewards that we get when we are in a close relationship. We may also get certain material rewards. So, think about relationships with maybe with your parents. They may provide you with like, food, housing when you're not in school. Maybe they help you pay for your school. So, kind of monetary benefits there. But with our friends, we may also think about kind of non-tangible benefits. So, if you've ever moved, you might have friends that come out and help you move boxes and provide their time to help you, move from one apartment to the next. And so they're sharing in those resources, whether it's material, like money resources, or whether it's, their time and kind of manpower to help you with that task. And that would still be considered a material reward. The last is health rewards. And so research has shown that having satisfied close bonds tend to yield more positive outcomes and health outcomes specifically. So having a set of people that are close to you, that know you, that interact with you regularly, it can ward off the negative effects of stress. So when you are experiencing a problem and you go to that person and they comfort you and they support you and they give you advice and they help you through that challenge, they are helping, potentially buffering the stress that could be caused by the challenge that you're experiencing. So, and the second kind of way in which relationships may help us is through protecting us and looking out for us. So, even thinking about parents, they try to protect you. Most parents try to protect you from harming yourself. I think about going out with my son, he's a runner, so I'm constantly pulling him back and, parking lots, making sure that he's not going to run out in front of a car and get hurt. But thinking even about your friends. So, if you are beginning to engage in, maybe you're drinking pretty heavily or, engaging in another negative activity, that friend may step in and say, hey, look, I've noticed that you're engaging in this behavior and it's kind of getting out of hand. Maybe we should do something about it. Or even in terms of promoting good healthy behaviors. So you may have a friend who you go and exercise with regularly, or maybe you're on a dieting plan together. So thinking about really pushing each other to engage in healthy behaviors as well. So those are some of the health rewards that we get just from being in a relationship. But we also know that relationships can carry costs. So thinking about your time invested, money invested in a relationship, if you aren't receiving, kind of an equal balance of rewards, which we'll talk about in the maintenance lecture for this chapter, then that relationship can become costly. Similarly, if you're constantly supporting a friend who seems to always be experiencing challenges, or maybe they're in a relationship that is toxic and they stay in that relationship and you're constantly supporting them and helping them out, that can be stressful for you. And so engaging in that emotional support for your friend over and over and over again that could result in that relationship being stressful for you in the end. We also know through things, study of like conflict, that sometimes our relationships that we are in are the stress in our lives. And so that's something that we think about. And we'll talk about that when we talk about social exchange theory and equity theory when we discuss relational maintenance in a different lecture for this chapter. We also know that personal relationships have some important characteristics and common characteristics. And the first is that close relationships require commitment. Commitment is our desire to stay in the relationship no matter what happens. So if there's conflict, if there's distress, you'll, at the end, after you've listened to all 4 lectures, you'll have an assignment. Your class discussion to listen to a podcast about a relationship that goes through a really difficult time and demonstrates high levels of commitment. And so this kind of commitment is this desire to stay in the relationship kind of no matter what happens. And we see that in certain trajectories for romantic relationships, right? Like you date for a while, you may potentially get engaged, then you commit, whether that's marriage or through a different kind of commitment ceremony, that you're going to stay with that person kind of through thick and thin. The traditional marriage vows say till death do us part, right? And so that language, that rhetoric really symbolizes this commitment, this intent to stay in the relationship, even maybe when it gets hard. Your chapter talked about 3 different levels of commitment. The first is emotional, and emotional commitment is a sense of responsibility for the other person's feelings and emotions and their overall well-being. So this idea that we kind of should use our communication to support each other and to respect each other. We talked a little bit about that when we talked about the language, positive communication environments in the language chapter, but really having this commitment to lift up the other person, to monitor and think about kind of their feelings and their overall emotional well-being. We also have social commitment. So it is this social commitment is the motivation to spend time together. Maybe it's a compromise about how you spend your time. So the social commitment would be like not always spending time going to sports events if that's what you like to do. Maybe you also go to a Broadway show because that's what your partner likes to do. So compromising in how you spend time together. Maybe compromising in who you spend time with. So thinking about spending time with each other's family. I know when my husband and I started dating, we really compromised about holidays, right? So if we spent Thanksgiving with one family, say my family, then we'd travel and spend Christmas with his family. So really thinking about making that social commitment to compromise and spend time with each other's family, because that's really important. Social commitment can also involve being generous with praise, avoiding petty conflicts, so really being able to compromise and spend time together. And then finally, some relationships get to the point where there's a legal or financial commitment. So these are more formal expressions of potential obligation to the other person, formal expressions of commitment. So we think about potentially like buying a house together or getting married as a legal commitment, having a child together. All of these things would fall into this kind of formal expressions of commitment, of being in that relationship in one way or another, right? And so thinking about that as a level of commitment here in this chapter. So we've talked about one important characteristic, the level of different levels of commitment. Close relationships have commitment in some way or another, but they also foster interdependence. And so interdependence occurs when this idea that the behavior of one person affects the behavior of the other person. And interdependence increases as a relationship grows closer, as the relationship develops. So you think about, in a marriage, I think about my family. I can't, like I did in college, just get up and decide that I'm going to fly to Colorado and see my sister for spring break. I have to make those arrangements with my family, with my husband, and think about what that means financially for our family, and think about who's going to take care of our son. Is my husband going to stay home? Is my son going to come with me? And so that one simple decision of whether I'm going to go see my sister for spring break really impacts my family in pretty important and intense ways. And that is right there, interdependence. That is this idea that our lives are so intertwined that much of my behavior affects how my husband operates, how my child operates, and how it impacts their lives. And as relationships grow closer, as they develop, then this level of interdependence oftentimes increases as well. Your lives become more entwined, and your behaviors begin to affect one another. The third characteristic is that close relationships require continuous investment. Investment essentially is how much you put into the relationship. I oftentimes will tell people relationships are work. right? They require effort. They require an investment on your part to engage in maybe behaviors that you don't want to do, or to engage in meta communication about how you're communicating, right? So this investment is really like how much effort you're going to put into the relationship, how much compromise you're willing to make. And in general, relationships desire equality. So they, again, when we talk about maintenance, we'll talk about the effort that you put in should in similar ways be matched by the other person. And when one person is putting in more effort than the other person, then we have some interesting things going on, and we'll talk about that later. Another thing that we'll talk about in a separate lecture, but I want to overview now, is dialectical tensions. So close relationships, mostly because we have commitment, investment, and interdependence, spark what we call dialectical tensions. And dialectical tensions are conflicts between two opposing needs or desires. And there are three dialectical tensions that we'll talk about, but essentially this idea of tensions suggests that because we have two people in a relationship, because there are high levels of interdependence, there may be times when my needs or desires conflict with my partner's needs or desires. And there are three ways that we'll talk about when we talk about relational maintenance that these desires and needs can kind of clash. And there are specific ways that we in our romantic or our relationships manage those dialectical tensions, and we'll talk about those as well. So that sums up our discussion, kind of overview, introduction of personal relationships. The next lecture is going to talk about how we form personal relationships. The third lecture in this series is going to really discuss maintenance of relationships. And the final lecture will briefly talk about terminating relationships. So what happens when we no longer want to maintain, we no longer want to be in that relationship? Well, we use communication to varying degrees to terminate those relationships, and we're going to talk about that as well.